Greetings, U.S. history students. Mr. Tuluki here. I'm going to give you some of my progressive era notes, part one. So you know, uh, basically for the rest of quarter one, we're going to really look at and kind of hit two different units. However, this will be the confusing part. Both of the units are really kind of happening at the same time in history. We're kind of looking at like 1890 to about 1920, that 30-year chunk of time. One of the units, half of the assignments we're doing will fall into the progressive era. The other half will fall into just like a foreign policy, like America becoming a world power unit. Now, these things are playing out simultaneously, meaning the same time. Uh, Essentially, think of it this way. One of the units, we're looking at American foreign policy, how America's interacting with other places in the world. And then the other will be looking at domestic policy, things that were happening, like reforms here in America. So we're starting with progressive era stuff, which is like the domestic, the home front, looking at different rules and laws and stuff and policy that was being changed here in America. Now, I know some of my notes were getting a little bit lengthy. I'm going to try really hard to like shorten those up into chunks. So like this is actually a pretty long PowerPoint, but I'm not going to do the whole thing today all in one sitting. We're going to have just a couple slides, and this would be a great time for you to get your notes out. I'd highly recommend. There'll definitely be some quiz and test questions, exam questions that are going to come off the slides that I'm about to cover. So I would strongly recommend that if you've been doing any U.S. history notes, get those out now. There will be a few things that you want to jot down. Okay, you don't really need to see my face anymore, so bye-bye. And here we go. I'm going to move that out of the way so you can see it a little bit better. First up, for the progressive era, anything that falls into, me talking about the progressive era, I want you to know that it's like 1890 to 1920, that 30-year-ish chunk of time. Now, there wasn't like one exact start date and one exact end date. But progressive era, it was just a time period where there were a whole lot of like reforms, law changes. The country was kind of, in some ways, in turmoil, much like it is right now. And like things were really shaken up. So that was true back in this 30-year chunk of time too. So got the dates down there. Let me see. There we go. All right. Again, at the top, progressive era, 1890 to 1920. Things I'd want you to know for the progressive era too. And also, like anytime we start a new chunk of notes, I'd recommend for what we did today, you start a fresh new page, or at the very least, if you already had other notes going on, draw a big line between like the early industrial revolution and the Henry Ford notes you already took and what I'm covering today. So this is kind of a new little like chunk or section of your notes. So this one I would put a heading in there like progressive era, put the dates right next to it. And then I'd want you to know for progressive era that this 30-year chunk of time, there was tons of reform and activism. So like a reform is like change for the good. Activism is, we see a lot of that today. That's people going out and trying to like get very political and influence their elected representatives and trying to get them to take action. I know that now, the progressive era, there were progressives that were Republicans and Democrats. So in some ways, it was very different this chunk of time from what it is today. It was maybe a little bit less polarized, where you had people in both parties that were progressives that wanted to see these reforms happen. Know that a lot of the focus of the progressive era was about ending moral and political corruption. So like just looking at horrible things happen in society, how maybe women were being treated, how kids were being treated. This is pre-child labor laws. Looking at corrupt politicians that are stealing money for their own personal gain and kind of cheating the people. That was a big part of this era, was like a lot of people were becoming aware of these things going on and were fed up with it and wanted to see changes. Know that most of the changes in the progressive era were a grassroots kind of change. That's a good word that I don't have up there, but you might want to write it in your notes. Grassroots means like from the bottom up. So most of the progressive reforms weren't enacted at the federal level. They weren't enacted by like the president and Congress. Actually, most of them started at the local level, the municipal level, which is another key vocab word for you. So that means like in local communities like city government and county government. Also, a lot of reforms got rolling at the state level, and then they spread to other parts of the country. Now, we did have some very progressive presidents too. I'll spend quite a bit of time in the near future talking about Teddy Roosevelt. He was a president that did get a lot of changes and reforms happening, but by and large, most of them were happening at the local level. Okay, next slide. Very important key word that I'll come back to throughout the unit, and I might even reference it way later on in the year. Muckrakers. Now, the term muckraker, you don't need to have this part of it. A muckraker comes from, it's basically like a poop raker. A muckraker was like a stable boy that would go into horse stalls and go into the barn and rake out all the poop, all the crap. Okay, kind of a gross job. But the muckrakers, like how I'm going to use that term in our classes, muckrakers are journalists that are exposing wrongdoing in society. So that is a key word you'd want to write down. You'll want to know who the muckrakers were. Now, if I ask you for a definition later, don't check the box or give the answer that it was some stable boy raking poop. Yeah, that's true. That's where the term came from. But how it applies in class, again, it's journalists that are exposing the underbelly of society, the horrible, like wrong things, the gross, sometimes dirty things that are going on in American life. And I'm going to give you some examples of muckrakers down the road in part 2 of these notes and actually read you some passages so you'll get a much better idea exactly what I'm talking about. Like, look at the kids in that picture. There were no child labor laws in the late 1800s. So you had situations. Now, most kids didn't go work in factories. If you had parents that loved you and they made a decent wage, well, you were probably in like grammar school learning to read and write. But if you came from a really poor family or you lived in the wrong zip code, you might likely have to get, like, by the time you're 10 or 12 years old, you might have to help put food on the table for your family. And the photograph right there in front of you are a bunch of kids that worked in a coal mine in West Virginia. So rotten job, you know what I mean? If you're 12 years old, my goodness, you don't want to be working in a coal mine. You want to be out playing with your friends and be outside. Anyway, most people in America were totally unaware that like kids at that age were working. This is pre-internet. You wouldn't have known, except these journalists take photographs and they write stories about it. And then when more people become aware, like people all over the country start demanding that you have child labor laws. So there's an example of what the muckraker journalists were doing. All right, the last notes that I'm giving you for today, so this will be the last term you're putting in today, is monopolies. Now, monopoly, that's not just a fun board game. It's actually a really important, like, economic term. For the time period we're talking about, a monopoly or a trust, they basically mean the same thing. There are some differences between them, but for our purposes in this class, covering this time in history, if you see the term monopoly or you see the term trust, no, I will kind of use them interchangeably. They suit the same meaning there. So a monopoly, if you don't know, this is what you'd want to write for a definition for a monopoly or trust. It's where one person or one company dominates the sale of a good or service. So it would be like if Ford Motor Company was the only car company out there, they would have a monopoly on cars. There was no General Motors, no Dodge, no Toyota. Then Ford would have that monopoly. Or it would be like, say Verizon goes and buys out every other cell phone provider, and the only company you can get a cell phone from is Verizon. They would have a monopoly. So I hope that makes sense to you. The U.S. government begins to crack down on those in the accumulation of monopolies under TR, which that stands for Teddy Roosevelt. He saw that as a problem, and I'm going to get into more like of Teddy Roosevelt's position on it in the near future. So know that, like, today, having a monopoly is illegal, but you go back 120 years ago, 130 years ago, it still was even technically illegal then, but the laws weren't enforced. So a lot of monopolies did exist. And that was how guys like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Henry Ford became so wealthy, because there was a chunk of time where they did monopolize their own respective industries, and they got filthy rich by doing it. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Follow up here. There's nothing you have to write down for these, but there's my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, who I'm going to do a very in-depth profile of in the near future. Feisty guy. He always has the bushy mustache and glasses on. Kind of looks nerdy, but actually a very tough individual, mentally and physically. Anyway, he got nicknamed the Trust Buster. That was a nickname he took on as president because even though he came from a wealthy family and never would have had to work a day in his life, he actually often was very critical of big businesses and corporations and the super wealthy and powerful. The political cartoon you're seeing on the left side, the beast is supposed to be, he's standing on the rock truss or monopolies. And it's like the woman he is holding is supposed to be Lady Liberty. It's like these monopolies, these huge corporations have held America hostage and they're doing damage to the American public and the American spirit. And then you see the arrow of democracy coming in. And it was like, there's a lot of other cartoons where it's specifically Roosevelt coming in and attacking these. But anyway, old Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, he was busting up monopolies. The last thing I have for you today is another political cartoon from the era. You see, this is supposed to be the Senate chamber, okay, where a lot of our laws are made. Now, the Senate was known for being especially corrupt at this time because the people didn't actually vote on their senators. You had a situation where, like, our representatives in Lansing would decide who the two senators for the state of Michigan would be. Doing it that way, and with these mega rich guys like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, Cornelius Vanderbilt, they had so much money, they were able to come in and really kind of buy politicians. So up top or on the back, if you follow my cursor, those big fat bags of money that also have heads on them and look like people. If you look really close, you see the copper trust, meaning the copper monopoly. Standard Oil Company was John Rockefeller's. Here's the Iron Trust, the Sugar Trust, coal, how there were different monopolies and all these. And it's saying this is the Senate of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. So the message is that basically all of our senators, they're not really doing that much work or discussing and trying to pass laws that are benefiting the people. They're trying to keep their masters up there happy, the guys that are giving them the big campaign donations. Okay, that's all the notes I got for you today. Hopefully this was a manageable chunk. We will be back in the near future for part 2. The other thing you have to do with your history time for today will be, I have another sheet, another attachment posted to this assignment, and you're going to have to go track down some vocab terms on your own. I would just include that stuff with the notes you hopefully already have going. Take care.